Well, that was certainly an interesting challenge in writing this book, as the world, as you alluded to in your comments, Helen, the world's, the tools at least, the motivation behind, not necessarily so, but the tools and the ways that many of these activities actually come into being changed so frequently as we were working on this project. When we first started the project, Twitter hadn't started yet as a platform, and we started working on this in late 2007 as a concept, and it's amazing how many generations have changed. Think about the evolution of mobile communication just over the course of a few years and so forth. So I'm very fascinated by the combination your class has of thinking and doing. And it's great to see, and in an academic environment, bringing those together as powerfully as it sounds like your graduate cohort is doing. So, looking forward to this discussion.
Well, one thing that may connect with what Joel was saying is that we really, really appreciated what someone in the class called your hyper-awareness of language, and clusters of users and makers that are outside the commercial domain, but not excluding all of these different kinds of communities. And so I'm going to tell you her question and may then jump to Joel. Given Spreadable Media's consistent and refreshing focus on how technology interacts with clusters of individuals rather than the gratification of a single consumer, perhaps it's time to start inventing new words for these emerging practices and behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and one of the challenges that I found as people think about building audiences for their media content, I hear from people so often who struggle, and one of the words we struggled with in the book is using the word audiences.
Yeah,
and because it is still this very passive, this very still sort of aggregate of passive faces. You imagine people in a darkened theater or, this sort of less than active role. And we chose it because we wanted to avoid words like consumer and so forth. But it does open up that challenge, which is that social connection. The other problem, I think, is as we continue, and you may have seen, there's a book out now called Contagious. That's selling quite well. It is, it is focused on some similar issues to Spreadable Media is going for, not a university press book, but by a B school author named Jonah Berger, and it certainly is spreading quite widely. And I think in part because there's still that focus on gaining a mass audience, right?
Yeah.
That our focus is success is defined by still how many people interact with your stuff, and yet so often, not just for independent filmmakers and people outside the mainstream, but even let's take marketing, right? And if you're McDonald's, anybody is a potential customer. But for most companies, they have fairly small groups of people who they're really trying to reach with their content, other than a very small select few companies. And I think it's interesting that we still take, everybody takes this sort of same mass communications one-way approach, and the way we understand the audience on the other end is not that sort of social cohort, community-based understanding, which I think is one of the reasons why marketers don't really understand their audiences very well. They can have hordes of market research data, but that doesn't actually tell you much. So I think our approach with the book was the metaphors we use, the terms we use to describe things, and so much to shape how we define our strategies as content creators and circulators. And so I think it's a great charge to take up to figure that out.
And Grace, who's there too, also commented, and she'll bring this up later, about your sensitivity to global audience, global participants.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
How do you, because I find myself in this trap all the time at work, and so I'd like to just ask a pro how you handle this. How do you not get pigeonholed into kind of one strategy? Because we know it's not one strategy fits all. I mean, that's exactly what you were just saying. But how do you keep yourself out from the from being in the weeds? Does that make sense? Because I find myself.
It's tough, very tough. I recommend two things, and this applies no matter if you are in a group of people creating media or if you're in a marketing role. The first, I think, is the firm I work for, Peppercom. Our tagline is listen, engage, repeat. And because
listen, engage, and what?
Listen, engage, repeat.
Oh,
and the repeat just means you can't stop listening. And part of our focus then, because that's our tagline, we go to our clients and say, listening's not an audit you do at the beginning of this. And in fact, that helps drive the point home that what you could listen to best practices or decent practices. I hate the word best practices because I don't think there are any in this space. Decent practices that other companies have done. And we can learn from those perhaps, but you have to listen to the audience you're trying to reach.
Right.
Understand the communities you're trying to reach. And the answer can't look like the answer does for another media creator. That's one way. The other way, though, I think, is sometimes we treat the person who's in charge of managing a project with the person who's in charge with looking at the strategy of the project. We often make that the same person. And sometimes project management and strategy management, it's hard for the same person to handle both those roles.
Right.
Different, especially if you're in the marketing world and you work in an agency setting or, like I do. That's one of the main issues we struggle with, which is it's easy to suggest services based on something that's worked before and just to replicate something you've done before, to have that off-the-shelf product. Now, the same if you're, for instance, a journalist and working in a newsroom, you could say, this worked for this, let's do the same thing here. And I think it's helpful to have somebody play that strategic planner sort of role that can say, well, that might have worked for that, but this is the story we're trying to tell. It can't work in quite the same way.
Yeah.
And one of the criticisms we'd gotten about the book at points was, well, if we focus too much on the audience, what about the story? What about the content of the story itself? That it's, doesn't the story still matter? And my argument is it does very much because
well, that's how you connect with your audience, right? It's
not going to spread if it's not something the audience you're trying to reach finds compelling. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that part, right? In fact, the FTC had a hearing yesterday about native advertising and content marketing. We could get into that whole question of transparency, which is fascinating. But their question was, what happens when the Wall Street Journal has the sponsored story right next to the editorial, and they look a lot alike, and can the average reader tell that was actually content applied by an advertiser? But another of the questions that raises is so many companies are now talking about content. And content is another word we struggled with in the book because we were trying to use a word that didn't designate which media type it was. And media text sounded too academic-y for the practitioner. So we used the word content, but the downside of that is, as I have a friend who says, content is what's inside a box. But it doesn't speak to quality at all. And for many, many media creators, whether they be marketers or they own a publication, that's often how they treat content, which is to say, we have a Twitter feed and we need to make sure we tweet 8 times a day.
Right.
We're filling a box with stuff.
Right.
And that stuff, it almost doesn't matter if it's good or bad.
Yeah.
It's just about the quantity and the frequency of that content. And I think that's
your audience.
Challenge.
So, because then your audience feels like it's no longer authentic communication.
Yeah.
So they're going to go somewhere else or just ignore the tweets.
You inundate people, and in fact, I think that sometimes brands think more is more, and that's part of the problem, right? You just increase the frequency. Now, I did want to get to Joel's question before we roll too far down the line, which is we could spend an hour talking about the question of how you communicate emotion and how you communicate beyond just text. And so much of early online communication was focused on text only in a way that I think has provided a lot of challenges. There have been a lot of people in the computer-mediated communications academic space who've looked at early chat room groups and early message boards and how difficult it was to communicate meaning through conversations that happen only over text. And I've certainly experienced that through email, as I'm sure you all have too. And I think sometimes we don't focus enough on the emotional components that drives communications and relationship building. So I think there is going to be so much more done over the next 10 years technologically and from a creator's standpoint to figure out how we find ways through our communications, through our content, to express that emotional dynamic rather than just the sort of aesthetic and information-driven dynamic of our stories. But, like the concept of transmedia storytelling, one of the things that I focus on is the question you need to ask is which platform or which medium can best convey the emotion of this part of the story. So my background's in journalism, and I think about, the problem early days of transmedia storytelling in journalism is a journalist filed a print story, then they set him down in front of a camera with about as good a lighting and production as I have right here, and he, summarizes the story he just wrote in 2 minutes for a video that they put up on the website. Well,
right.
That's not very good use of the platform. Yet you can imagine for that story there could have been a snippet of video that would have captured the emotion of a moment in a way that the whole front page could have been written and not captured. And I think that becomes part of the question we ask, which is how do we really capture the emotional essence of a story? So, I do think through any form of communications, it's interesting as we're trying to get to the bottom of that equation, which is for people to really immerse themselves in a story. I think emotion has to be conveyed, and the way we package. I might reference again, I study pro wrestling is one of the areas that I study, and I was making a joke about pro wrestling earlier. I'm very fascinated with how the character, in the pro wrestling world, the wrestlers and the characters in the story, the talent who plays those roles manage their own social media presence. And what I love is, the evil wrestling manager. There's a character named Paul. There's Paul Heyman as his character, and he's really this dislikable, sleazy manager who manages the bad guys, and he comes out and he argues with the fans. And of course, in an arena of 15, 20,000 people, he can only really argue with the fans. It's him in one to many, right? People in Pittsburgh are idiots. Well, on Twitter, he's able to do that one-on-one, and that's what he spends his time doing. Fans will tweet at him, and he'll insult fans on an individual basis. And, I think it's a great use of the platform because he's performing his character perfectly in this very interactive, participatory manner in a way that is completely, has complete continuity with the role that he plays on TV. And I think there's a lot, pro wrestling, I'm not saying you all as media creators should go out and insult your audience of social media, but it worked for his character.
When I want to.
I think somebody else had started to ask a question. Maybe it was Grace.
It's going on regarding your talk about you guys were just talking about the kind of the quality versus the quantity, but my observation is just, how do you really reward quality in the media environment we have now? It's more like the way the technology is set up is you reward quantity. The more stuff you have out there, the more visible you are. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One would be, depending on how you define what success is going to look like from the outset. And that's one of the problems I find for content creators, whether they be in marketing or a media creator of any sort, is if we define success only by volume of traffic or number of people who see something, I think that that sometimes is one of the challenges. I think a piece of quality content, for instance, often becomes enduring. And I think back to the thesis behind Chris Anderson's long tail theory, which creates this space for stories that may not generate a mass audience, but also isn't like the BuzzFeed story of the day that nobody remembers 2 weeks from now, right? It's not as of the moment. So that, like the BuzzFeed story, will be highly spreadable in the moment.
Is it retainable?
Yeah, and there's value in that, right? So to go back to the introduction of the book and Harold Ennis's distinction between marble and papyrus, that idea that there are some communications and some, I love the Daily Show, and I DVR it every night. But sometimes I'll watch one that's 3 months old because I happen to not delete it over the course of the of our communications, and in that case, it's stale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Try to read a newspaper from 4 months ago. It has certain anthropological value. It doesn't necessarily carry with it the same sort of social value that it had. Versus, a piece of, our hope with something like this book project, which was, to publish the book and to imagine it won't necessarily, we knew it wasn't going to be, one of the top 10 books and available in the airport bookstore and, that sort of mass audience book. But our all hope is also that it's something that people would, because it's not focused on tactics of this moment,
right,
but it's focused on some deeper issues. Our hope is that somebody can pick it up 6 years from now and still find some degree of value in it. And I think, that's one of the real keys here. So
longevity. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions in the meantime?
I have a quick question. Another quick question about so to kind of diversifying your lack of a better word, content, right? So like, how often do you, with the story that you want to tell, or with what you want to put out, how often do you find your strategy within the story, within the content? Like, how often does that define your strategy on how you're going to relate to your audiences?
Yep. Well, I think it's an important part of it. And again, getting back to that question of the power of the story versus listening. We mentioned this a little bit, I think, in the chapter that talks about crowdsourcing, which raises the question, if you crowdsource a story to the point that you just want to provide the audience with whatever it is you think they want,
mm-hmm.
taken to an extreme, you would give the audience something they wouldn't like at all.
Right.
If you were to stop at every moment and ask the audience what they want to happen next, you would give them a story that's precisely what they expected and nothing that they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people look to a storyteller to understand them and provide them something that fits in with what they're interested in, but also tell them something they didn't know they wanted to know, or take them to a place they didn't know they wanted to go. I think of the trust. If you listen to NPR faithfully, or you subscribe to, your newspaper of choice, and you do so because you trust the curatorial instincts of the people who provide that, and you trust them to tell you what you don't already know. And I think that, but with a set of values or a set, an ethos that you trust. We draw a little bit early on in the book on Alec Austin's writing about the implicit contract. You all may remember, it's a short piece that's on our site, but he did his master's thesis work on the idea of the implicit contract. And that is to say, you would watch a TV show, and I think he used House as an example, if any of you have ever watched the TV show House, the medical drama. And he said, you'd watch House and you have certain things that you expect from House. You expect House to provide you with some comedy, some kind of dark sort of sarcastic humor throughout the episode. You expect there's going to be some kind of medical mystery or drama. And you expect often, at least early on in House, that it would tackle some sort of controversial issues, right? There would be debates about religion or debates about certain social issues and questions that the team has to wrestle with. And he said, as creator, you can perhaps take the show to someplace unexpected, as long as you don't go too far from the realm of the audience's expectation, right? The audience doesn't necessarily want to go to a horror movie and have it turn into a romantic comedy 1/3 in, if it was marketed as a horror movie. Some of you may have that happen. So I think
it sucks. I hate it when that happens.
Yeah. Well, and I think that idea though of exploring the story, but within the realm of what the audience expects from how you have labeled. Jonathan Gray provides an interesting piece in the book about the use value of authors and the way we tag things. Right? There's a movie out soon called Nebraska. from Alexander Payne. And the fact that it's from Alexander Payne means a certain thing to me. Now, I expect this movie to go places I didn't expect it to. I expect it to take me a place I didn't expect, but that's still an expectation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the story, the creator, if we create an environment where the creator is so beholden to this imagined audience or so beholden to data, I think of the fear around Netflix and Amazon creating content is that there's this discussion that, well, Netflix knows its audience so well because it can measure every click, every move, every user motion, that they could construct the perfect show. That is a myth that got a lot of pickup in the press. But what's interesting about a show like House of Cards is they base half of that on data, right? Yeah. But that's, they didn't make every creative decision about that show based on data. If they had, it would have been terrible beyond belief, because they can't say, Netflix audience is like A, B, C, D, E, and F, and we can only do those things. And we have to have the story end with X and do Y. And I think sometimes we run the risk in a data-driven world of losing the creativity that the creator can bring to the story. That is actually why the audience comes, right? If you can't tell a story any better than the story I could tell myself, I wouldn't need the content creator in the first place. I'd just read it myself.
But Sam, also, I posted about this book I have not read called Blockbuster, but I did read a review of it. Are you familiar? It's basically, she's looking at, the phenomenon, the blockbuster, only kind of intensifying in this particular era, and that we're moving into a kind of winner takes all situation in media. Now, that's really antithetical in many ways to what you're talking about in Spreadable Media, that in fact, there are lots of different kinds of spaces. But in that idea of the winner takes all, and the rest of us, the 99%, are out there either gifting or begging on Kickstarter or looking at small audiences, I know that this is a thread that's very tense for everybody going through the spaces. And I know you've been asked this question a million times, but really we have to think how we can earn a living from doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I think it's, Grant McCracken says who's actually at danger is the fat middle. It's not the blockbuster and it's not the niche creator, but it's that content which was not big enough to be blockbuster, but not niche enough to find a dedicated sort of the 1,000 true fans, as some people have said, is the model. And I think it's interesting to think about that because, it would be the middle of the road content that's meant to sort of least common denominator sort of entertainment is what's at most risk here, which is your traditional sitcom, for instance, network sitcom is at risk because nobody minds watching it, but nobody wants to either. And that becomes a challenge because blockbusters seem to continue to thrive, to your point. But also we're seeing this market where people can make, I think a living might be stretching it in some cases, but can make some income based on distributing their content. Yeah, I would recommend everybody check out the work that Nancy Baim is currently doing. We draw on her work somewhat in chapter 6, I believe it is, of the book, looking at indie creators. And her research is focused on music. But she's one of the things she questions is the difficulty that now we are at. So the old model was that the studios picked the acts that really made it, and they only picked a few. And if you weren't one of those acts, you were pretty well, amateur or on a geographically local basis, like the gospel quartets we reference in the book, that you could just travel a few spot shows, or you had a big record deal and there wasn't a whole lot of room in between. Now, it's wonderful now that anybody, the technology to make to release a song is so the barrier is so much lower. But she argues that the downside of that is now, in order to make it as an artist, you have to have entrepreneurial skills.
Yes.
And the people who are great artists aren't necessarily people who are great self-promoters and great at managing relationships with their audience. And to what degree is it fair to expect a filmmaker, a writer, an artist to have to be the one to directly manage the relationship with the community? That those are skill sets. And it's a great question, because on the one hand, I see a lot of value in this, and I'm a proponent of, if you're a content creator and you're trying to reach a community, get to know that community, become part of it. But I'm also sympathetic to the fact that that becomes a separate part or an unfunded mandate to the rest of the actual work of the labor of creating your art. And that seems to be the trade-off the space that we're entering in. And do you have people who may not, by personality type or whatever the case might be, may not be great networkers and are wonderful artists that find themselves at a disadvantage in this space to people who have inferior artistic talent but much greater networking ability and skills. Right. Those are trade-offs, right? Those are troubling at the same time. So I think it is interesting in terms of how to approach this, how to think about ways independent artistic communities can support one another, can find ways to do that relationship building, to build audience, but not that puts unrealistic expectations. Because you do end up, you get to know your fan base emotionally attached to you, especially when you're a niche creator. If you have a particularly passionate fan base, they develop, they feel they know you, especially because you're very intimately involved with your audience. We see this in newsrooms with journalists. Right now, if you're a journalist, you just as well be a freelancer, even if you're in-house somewhere, because at a lot of places they're charging the journalist with promoting their own stories. And they're measuring success increasingly in the newsroom on whose story drew the most traffic, who's been shared most online, who generated the most comments. So you have journalists, who create their own Twitter accounts and are out there trying to build relationships in the community, connect with people. That's not all bad. A lot of that's really good. They get to know the audience they're trying to reach. They become part of the community in the ways journalists typically haven't. The downside is they're also sort of out there trying to promote themselves, and I think in ways that sometimes might distract from the part of the job they're actually getting paid for, because again, it's an unfunded mandate. Often journalists aren't given extra pay or extra time for this community management, community relationship building function. It's something that's just sort of, this is a soft skill you're also expected to do for the same salary.
Well, Sam, that's something that's come up in our group about authenticity, and it comes up for me as one of those people you just identified. When I see my fellow filmmakers self-promoting, or we won't say it, or making relationships with their users, there is a fine line, and our whole class here is about discerning distinctions. When you do your kind of self-promoting, it's very different than when your fan base or your people or people who love what you do spread the word.
Yes.
Do you ever think about that, in terms of the idea of listening and how it can be kind of authentic without you as the artist hustle your own self? Because it's very different when I hustle for you and you hustle for me, but when we do our own, it feels weird.
Yeah, agreed. And
for the audience too, for the receivers.
Yes, absolutely. And I often argue with people, if you, for instance, in my realm, being in academia, if I write a piece, if I do something, how much, in the process sometimes of interacting with the people who then read, like, for instance, how we struck up a conversation. Here's a class that's reading the book that I co-authored, and how to approach that. And I've seen people who would have seen that and then retweeted what you said about it in a very sort of, there's a guy in wrestling who I always loved. He said, break your arm trying to pat yourself on the back. I love that. I love that quote. But you see people do that. It's like someone says, "Really love your book. We're reading it in our class," and then they would retweet that to their audience. Now, as opposed to sort of reaching out and interacting, which I think feels more natural. In some cases, you may still have a small self-promotional part of that, which is that sort of engagement, et cetera. But I think in as much as what you're promoting is the community or the people you're interacting with rather than yourself, that's when it can become valuable. And I think finding that balance is key. But it's a fine line. You're right, and it is a one we have to be very careful about as content creators, I think, which is when you find an audience that's promoting your stuff, how do you make real connections with that audiences who are interested in your stuff without sort of being overbearing about it, without being too overtly promotional. And I say this to huge companies too, which is, I was in a meeting with somebody yesterday, and they said, we do X, Y, and Z for the community, but we don't like to go out and brag about that too much because it seems to defeat the purpose of why we're doing it. But some of their competitors do, and they're always, we donate 20%, we do X, we do Y. And I was telling them they're really in the better position by not going overboard and bragging and promoting themselves. But if there are ways that they can promote the communities they're trying to help, rather than talking about themselves, I think there can be great value in that. I think that, as an artist, a similar approach. One thing I want to make sure we talk through at some point, Helen, were those, you sent me 2 excellent questions via email, and I'd love to touch base on both of those. So I just want to make sure we don't forget that.
Well, one of them was from Amanda Eckerson, who really did bring up the idea of, how can spreadability really work at a real-time environment outside of the virtual world. And then she also brought up another question, and I'll let you go on both of them, is does spreadability have real-time effect for long-term deep change? Do you think it's really designed to be useful for that? And I guess, yeah, go for it.
It's an interesting question because we've seen, we've seen some discussion along the way of, well, first of all, I'll talk about the online only. And that is that I think, part of the problem is we've created this dichotomy of the real world and the online world in a way that makes no sense. And in fact, I think if you look at the social connections we have, the relationships we maintain, very often many of them are based on real physical communities we've lived in or been part of. You could look at my Facebook friends, for instance, and see that a good portion of them are in Kentucky, where I live, or they're in Boston, where I went to grad school, or were people who went to grad school with me in Boston but are now elsewhere. They're based in New York City, where I lived for a couple of years, so on and so forth. And I think this idea sometimes that spreadability is an online thing only, and it's only about sort of trying to get your content seen by as many people as possible, gets back to that question we were talking about earlier, which is success can only be defined as a massive hit, as a blockbuster in this space, because sometimes you're trying to reach a very particular community. And when you're trying to reach a very particular community, we have to think about success quite differently, because then it's about depth of interaction with that community rather than the number of people who saw something. And, I work with a lot of companies that are in the B2B space. So their professional services, who they're trying to reach is a very small audience of other professionals. Really, if you think about it, if you're in marketing, you're in the B2B space yourself, right? You're talking about marketing to the people who work in marketing, and that is when you're talking about marketing or trying to sell to a potential client, that is a very small world in the grand scheme of things. You don't necessarily want your messages to be seen by, your grandpa or, whoever. That is not an audience member you're trying to reach. And so to interact, to go viral really makes no sense in that context. And I think that, often great case studies of spreadability are videos that have a few hundred views in some cases within a small local community based on an issue you're trying to raise awareness on. And I think sometimes we forget about those because we ran this risk with the book. Sometimes we highlighted case studies like the Susan Boyle example we started the book with or elsewhere that we're trying to demonstrate the scale of how something can circulate via word of mouth. But, in the process, are we glorifying scale to the exclusion of stories that have deep impact on really small, particular communities. And I think that's a balance that we have to achieve. The other thing you hear some discussion about is the term slacktivism, which I think we may have used at some point in the book, is that idea of does passing something along start to replace actual deeper action of some sort, which gets to that question of trying to, if you're trying to make some sort of change with or inspire some sort of action through your content, how does spreadability help achieve that? But I really appreciate, there was a lot of controversy, you all may remember this, over changing your avatar when the Supreme Court was deliberating marriage equality. Changing your avatar to show your support for marriage equality. And a lot of people said, well, this is useless because it's not going to in any way affect the Supreme Court's decision. These people, if they really care, should be marching in Washington or X, Y, and Z. And what was fascinating about that was the counter argument was, I can't, and I really appreciated this, someone said, I can't imagine that there was anybody who said, well, I was planning my trip to Washington to go march, but then I realized I could instead put up an equal sign on my Facebook page, so I guess I'll stay home. That, really we're not talking about an either-or here. And a lot of the audience who only participates at the level of spreading something, saying something, passing a story along, that isn't excluding them, that isn't replacing, those aren't the audience in the first place that would have been the really dedicated activists in a prior world. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind. The other part of the argument with that example that I've made in the past is the idea of showing you support marriage equality may seem like a lazy act in terms of slacktivism, but if you were here in Kentucky and you had a very conservative family and you posted on Facebook to your family and friends that you support marriage equality, that might actually be a very bold act in the micro life of that individual human being and the small community they live in. I teach a class, and we were talking about this issue during last spring during that time period. And one of my class members said, I applaud some of the other people who've done that, who posted about their support of marriage equality, because I couldn't bring myself to do it, even though I support it. I didn't want to upset my parents. I didn't want to upset my high school teacher, that I know feels differently. And so sometimes I think we forget that what may seem like an insignificant act in the grand scheme of things, in the individual lives of the person who circulated a piece of material, which seems like a very small, insignificant act, could have been, is often an act of courage.
Well, when we talk about transmedia, then what you're actually saying is that the sort of live encounters that people can have interfacing with media, audiences, music, art, and so on, the real-world connections are just as important and need to be innovated as much as thinking online as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that the fact that someone circulated something to you matters as much as the content, or even more so at the moment you receive it. So I always give as an example, I have certain people I trust, certain friends who forward me news stories via email. And I will often spend the first half of reading that story thinking more about my relationship with that person and why they sent this to me than I am the actual piece of content. That sometimes we forget that the way we experience, as we live in a world where people are increasingly finding information not from the distribution pipeline of the media company, but from one another, that who the one another is heavily shapes the relationship we have with that piece of media content, that it circulates through the flows of relationships. And I think that gets back to that question of emotion, which is our emotional relationship with the person who was distributed that content with us actually deeply shapes our perception of the material that we're interacting with.
Well, that's definitely true in this class because, and this will get to the other question about gifting, is everybody in this class has said to me over and over, how come I never knew about these projects that we've been looking at? I didn't know any of this National Film Board of Canada work existed. How come we didn't know about it? On the other hand, then I could turn to someone like Joel and say, how come I never knew about Lil B or James Burke? I don't know about any of this stuff as well. So we all kind of collect, like you said, and then we seed in different areas all these different kinds of experiences with one another. But can we get to our other kind of more harder journalistic question that Melissa brought up? And she actually turned it into a question. And let me know if you ever get this from other people. If the gifting economy is a successful spreadability model, why didn't the three of you give Spreadable media? If you had, perhaps it would have reached a wider audience and motivated more consumers to purchase the expanded version of the book.
It's a great question, and I, my response would be, we did. By the time the book came out, so we worked on the book from 2007 to 2013. By the time the book came out, there is probably nothing in it that we hadn't already published or presented elsewhere. The book, the unique proposition of the book is to have all those arguments and all that content in one place. And we thought of the book as basically a collection or a snapshot of the project we've been working on for the past 6 years in one place. But through Henry Jenkins runs a blog where we had presented a lot of this stuff. We ran a research group called the Convergence Culture Consortium, and much of what was in the book was published as white papers that were publicly available before the book came out, including the white paper that was the germ of the idea was called If It Doesn't Spread, It's Dead, which had come out a few years before. And we presented at a lot of conferences most of the ideas from the book. I write for Fast Company, and I had written several of the things from the book beforehand. So my first argument has always been the press was okay with the fact that in an academic publishing world where it takes years to take a project from beginning to end, since we were publishing with the university press, that, by the time the book came out, they knew we were basically, this was all going to be material that had been published elsewhere. In fact, we argued that's part of the point of the book, that we aren't, we are salaried professionals and we're not trying to make our living off the sale of these books. So we're often, we're not in the shape of the independent artist, which is to say, we wanted the ideas to be out there and to circulate. Now, having them in a book format from a prestigious university press has gotten the book in the hands and attention of people who, even though all that material had been out there and had been circulated, wouldn't have seen it. I would argue that probably this class may have not read this book had it not been published by NYU Press and had gone through traditional peer review and so forth. Now, the trade-off of that is, of course, NYU Press has a business model and a way that they support their publishing business and so forth that brings their book out. And I very well will receive some royalties off of this as well. So I think there's certainly, we could have published, and we had discussed this, we could have published like a Creative Commons or released the book sort of outright. There would have been some potential great value in that. In our mind, again, with the trade-off, going through NYU Press and having that sort of validity, having their distribution system took the idea to places it might not have gone if we hadn't gone that route. So, I think that is, but it's a very interesting question. One of the things I've then done since the book's come out is basically continue to share ideas from the book and publish pieces and excerpts from the book and so forth to a variety of different audiences. But I think it's a great question to ask and poke and prod through. My argument is if you were to write a book called The End of the Book today, it would still be a book because books play that valuable role in our society, and we still treat books with a certain reverence that I think is crucial. But I think it's a very valid question to raise. For us, it was still an important aspect of getting the argument out there. And I think in the original blog post she'd written, she used Nina Paley's approach as an example. And what I think is interesting about Nina Paley's approach isn't just that she gifted it, it was that she still sort of, she had a model in which she still asked audiences to bring value to it. It was a different model than we took. But, I don't think, I'm not praising Nina, Nina, I don't think artists will ultimately be expected to put their work out there without any recompense. And I don't think we want to create models where only offering things as a gift becomes the model. Because to your point, we have artists that need to make a living. Now, in academia, where you're supported through salary and you're expected to publish, I think finding more and more ways to get arguments out there in open access, to not charge for them, to get ideas circulating freely, is of great value. But I think there's also, the business model part of this is one we still have to wrestle with. And I think we don't want to shut artists out of that, to say information should be free and the people who create it don't deserve any of the value from that creation. So it was a fantastic question.
Hey, everybody there that's watching. As we begin to kind of wind up the conversation, do you have any other comments or questions that you'd like to pose to Sam as we almost begin to end? We could go on for a long time here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask a follow-up on that, on what you just said. I was wondering, can you speak at all to the idea that sometimes if people aren't paying for it, they don't value it as much? I mean, sometimes I'll do that if I see something, material that's for free. I'll assume that somebody hasn't put as much work or effort or whatever into it.
Yeah, well, I think it does speak to that. And that was actually one of the other thoughts we had about the book, which is to say several people who bought the book had read portions of the argument before ever buying the book, or they had heard us talk, and they had heard certain portions of the argument. But we still find great value, I think, often find some substance, whether it be the ebook or the physical book, and having the sort of complete collection of the idea at the moment. I'll give you this example, using this book again as I was working on the book and doing talks, but after the book was published and I was doing talks and still presenting ideas from the book, it's amazing how much different that's treated, right? The fact that even if somebody doesn't read the actual physical book in the end, the fact that it came from a book still held certain value. I find that funny. But so, like media calling or wanting to quote you, et cetera, if you were an expert on this subject, maybe, but you just wrote a book about it this year, suddenly that brings a certain extra level of gravitas behind. So, we still live in a credentialized society in so many ways, but I think that does speak to the fact that, for a content creator, I think you want stuff to be able to circulate for free, but your audience also pays for the premium, right? They pay, and I think that's the model we're often seeing creators set up, was the one we took where we published bits and pieces of the idea here and there. But at the end of that, if you're interested in the whole thing, there is, you could buy the book. And I think that, is some version of that model is what we're seeing a lot of content creators move toward.
Well, in fact, I even saw Walter Isaacson, the biographer, Walter Isaacson, is writing a book about Alan Turing, and he tweeted saying, I have just written a chapter in this book, and it's on Scribd, and I welcome you to read my chapter and give me feedback. Now, he's at a level, not like a lot of people, where that wouldn't seem particularly necessary. Yep. But clearly it's very interesting to do. So in a way, what you're also saying is that the idea of like I'll say what we do is watch and share is not mutually exclusive with creating a kind of beautifully or well put together traditional object or product, because the two audiences may or may not be mutually exclusive. And when you frame it to your people or your participants or your users or audiences, that in fact this is what you're intentionally doing as a creator, people will take note.
You can look, we use the example in the book of Cory Doctorow, the science fiction author in his model, which, you know, he often put his whole work out there as he was working on it or when he finished it, and said, you know, maybe there was some small degree of cannibalization, but he quotes Tim O'Reilly's was the original person who had this quote, but this idea that most people suffer not from piracy or self-cannibalization, they suffer from obscurity, right? The fact that maybe, you know, Dr. O was basically saying maybe I lost a few people by putting a bunch of my work out there for free, but a bunch of those people still ended up buying the work even after they'd seen it for free because they wanted the actual book. And many other people heard about me for the first time through some of the stuff that circulated. And I think that's
Sam, do you really believe that? I mean, seriously, at this point, after everything, do you believe that is a truth?
Yes, I do. I mean, for the most part, when you're talking, you know, for the average person, more people, if you're an independent creator, especially, more people don't know about your work than do. And, you know, I know for a fact there are plenty of people who have seen, you know, pirated versions of our book, etc. Doesn't bother me a bit. In fact, I would say, if anything, it's probably overall added to the sales of the book because word circulates and people find out about it. You know, the average person doesn't know about this work that I've created. You know, if anybody is hurt by piracy, it's big studios, but their margins are so high, you know, we could argue that they're also the least impacted in a way because they still have access to massive audiences.
Well, one final question from someone else. You know, when you were talking about listening and to listen to the audience and find ways to move the company closer to the audience's wants and needs. And he asks you very directly, do you know of anyone who's successfully implementing this kind of approach to marketing? Or is this a lesson you think the industry has yet to learn?
For the most part, it's a lesson the industry's yet to learn. For the most part. So I would say there are no best practices. I've seen companies take more seriously an approach to doing this sort of thing. I'll give you as an example. I'll use this, a very recent example. I wrote a piece for HBR about Lowe's not too long ago because I had a customer service issue that had stretched on for over a year with Lowe's. And I wrote about some of the systemic problems within that organization that caused it. Well, in conversation with Lowe's since then, I found Lowe's has hired this fabulous friend of mine. Her name's Laura Lee, and she is basically creating a customer experience division of Lowe's, and with the idea of trying to listen to and understand and empathize with the experience the customer's having and transform the way the company responds to that customer. You know, it's really starting with the audience's experience first. You know, we could look at but I think the number of brands that do that are very, very small. Nobody's doing it perfectly. A few other examples I've heard tell of is there was a bank in Switzerland, Credit Suisse. Some of you all may have heard of that bank in the past. And one of the things they did is they transformed their company by taking the senior executives down to the branches and having them stand in line, have them go through the process of filling out a form, etc. Because they said the problem often is that the people who run a company or the people who are creating media don't know the lives often of the people that it is they're trying to reach. And I feel like those sorts of one-off examples are getting at where marketing needs to shift. I don't think there's any company out there, period, that's the exemplar in this case. You know, we highlighted Domino's honesty about how its pizzas weren't very good as an example in the book, and we highlighted what Comcast did when it tried to transform its customer service in the book. I think these are great little, small examples, but they're not holistic ones. Companies just, haven't traditionally been asked to listen. I think ethnographic work is a great place where companies are transforming more and more and trying to really understand the company from the audience's viewpoint and the world from the audience's viewpoint. But, seventh generation, I have a friend named Carol Sanford who works with seventh generation. They've done a lot of interesting stuff, and they're a company that a lot of people, their audience base, their customers admire them anyway. But they've focused on continuously saying, how can we be even more responsible? How can we continue to transform the way we do every part of our business and every part of our process? and they don't spend a lot of time telling you, other than their positioning and their name. They don't just, tell you how great they are. In fact, they focus often on communicating how they still want to improve on the parts that they're not doing so well. In fact, some of their marketing is often focused on that. And I think that's a very authentic way to approach it, which is to say, we want to provide you reliable products. We want to do so sustainably. Here are the areas that still trouble us about our business model, and we're trying to find ways to make that better. That's much better than beating their chest to say we're much more sustainable than the other competitors in our space. And I think it's focused much more on listening to their audience and trying to take their business toward where their audience wants it to go.
Hey, everyone, what do you think?
Yeah, any other questions? I've got a few more minutes.
Yeah, I mean, people have done media curated projects this quarter, and they've also gone through a very, very quick public engagement effort with the projects that they've done. And are there any thoughts out there about, what you have done and, how it kind of lines up?
Well, one of the things I can mention is the observation from our project, which actually I just posted in our class blog, was that we're talking about slacktivism, and I think one area where that probably I think shouldn't work is, and this is a revelation to me because we happen to have this. Our project is about basically invasive species education, which is a pretty obscure topic, but it's that kind of a thing that for things to happen effectively, you really have to talk to kind of niche audiences. Nothing much is going to happen if you. Well, I guess on a very superficial level, you probably can have people posting avatar about it, but it's not gonna really be effective if you really don't try to go deeper into the audiences and try to effect changes. So that's my take on it's effective to a certain extent, I guess.
We make a distinction at one point in the book between, and this was really focused on the chapter on television engagement, but it focused on spreadability versus drillability. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the focuses I would say is that that's not an either or proposition. That often I'll use a TV example. The show Breaking Bad was highly popular, and it was popular because it was a drama you could drill down really deeply into the experience of. You could engage it extremely deeply. On the other hand, there were also many bits along the way. Jimmy Fallon did a sort of parody of Breaking Bad, or some of you all may have seen, they did a Malcolm in the Middle parody alternative ending to Breaking Bad, so on and so forth, that were highly spreadable. And I think it's interesting to think about as you approach sort of a project for social change. How do you make sure you incorporate elements of both? Which is for the people who want to get deeply immersed and involved in this and who want to take their dedication to deeper levels, that you provide an easy mechanism for that, but that you also provide mechanisms for them to take. We use the World Wrestling Entertainment case study in the book, and one of the things we argue is WWE has found value in providing an avenue both for the really dedicated fan and the really casual fan, and to realize that the really dedicated fan is the one who often keeps the casual fan still in orbit, right? They provide enough gravity to keep the person who only watches once in a while or comes to the matches once in a while still peripherally interested. And I think with a social cause sort of project, that still ends up often being the case. You want a mechanism for your supporters. You also want to provide a mechanism for your supporters to keep their wider communities still engaged, even if those people are never going to become deeply dedicated, parts of the team. And thinking about both those things that can be the challenge. I think sometimes we get really good at one or the other. I often say part of it is providing that deeper mechanism for people to get more involved, but then providing them with shareable content, stuff they can spread for their purposes, right?
Right.
One of the things we try to get at in the book is keep in mind why someone would want to spread your stuff. It's because they want to say something about themselves. They're trying to build community. They're trying to communicate who they are and what they care about to their family and friends or their colleagues. And, sometimes I think companies provide material about what they want to talk about. Or if you have a cause, you're trying to provide material about what you want to talk about, not necessarily how your audience would want to talk about it to their audience. And I think that's one of the charges for us to keep in mind. I will recommend, there's a project at USC, University of Southern California, called Civic Paths. Henry Jenkins is somewhat involved in that, but they're doing a lot of great work about different youth, particularly youth participatory groups from all sides of the political aisle. They're looking at Muslim American groups. They're looking at young Tea Party activists. They're looking at the sort of the Dream activists, for instance, as among three of the projects that they've tackled. I'll also recommend Ethan Zuckerman's Center for Civic Media at MIT, which does a lot of great work about how groups are organizing and creating content for civic engagement and really trying to do a lot of what I think it is you're wrestling with this project.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, it really gets back to a lot of what George Lakoff has always talked about with, how the left really puts itself out in the world compared to conservative groups.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what we'll really be thinking about right now as we let you go is something that many of us really maybe can work with, which is the idea of creating these emotional experiences that are authentic and not manipulating emotion, which is propaganda, but the idea of how in this new space in the future we are going to create truly moving emotional experiences for people and not use their time ineffectively for that. They're effective for us, these emotional experiences, because I want to leave with saying that when you are engaged in a spreadable media space, any of you who've tried it, we too really receive a lot from this kind of activity as makers.
Yeah.
So it's very different maybe to have a group of 20 people discussing your films in a little room than a broadcast where, theoretically 1 million people watched it, but you don't have really any ideas coming out. It's different. It's very different. But the two interacting with one another, or all of these spaces interacting, is what's creating a very rich, what you call very emotional experience.
Well, yeah, it has been quite gratifying writing a book to then meet up with people who are approaching the thing you were writing about from a very different lens than you were. That's some of what's happened with this class. But I have, over the process of the past few months, ended up in deep conversations with people in the ebook space, in the library space, in the art space, several other places who happened along either the book or some excerpt they'd found from the book, and I happened to find a mention that they'd made, and we got into a deep conversation. They brought up all sorts of things that would have been perfect for the project as we were working on it. But that's to me what's so fascinating, because I think sometimes we forget there's so much of a learning experience we can have as the creator of content from then seeing how audiences pick it up and what they do with it once we put it out there.